Okay, so we were discussing the beginning of Mitzvah. So let's go back to where we were. The Mishnah says that Shnayim Ochazin Betalis, if two people hold on to an object, meaning there's a dispute about the ownership of an object, each one claims that he is the only owner, he's the sole owner. Neither of them have any evidence, any witnesses. So it's Ruvain's word against Shimon's word. That's a dispute. So the Mishnah says, Shnai Moksum Batalis, two people holding on to a talis, Ze Omer Kula Shali, Ze Omer Anim, I'm sorry, Shnai Moksum Batalis, Ze Omer Ani Mitzasiya, Ze Omer Ani Mitzasiya, Ze Omer Kula Shali, Ze Omer Kula Shali, Ze Yishava Shein Lapachas Michatzia, Ze Yishava Shein Lapachas Michatzia, V'achlokum. So each one testifies that he has not less than half. And then we split the object, or the value of the object, really, between them. However, let's say Ze Omer Kula Shali v'Ze Omer Chesya Shali. Let's say one fellow says the whole thing belongs to me, same as the first case, but the other fellow says actually the two of us are partners. So I admit that 50% belongs to Ruvain, says Shimon, but 50% belongs to me. So the
And
Mishnah
the
says,
basis for his 50% is that he says that they both picked it up at the same time?
yeah, they all both picked up at the same time, or they were partners, something like that. Yeah. So, so the in this case, the way we resolve the problem is that Ha'omer Kula Shali Shava She'ena B'Pachos Mishlosha Kalakim, the person who claimed that the whole thing belonged to him, takes a shvua that he doesn't own less than 3/4. The Omer Chetzia Shali, the fellow who admits that he only owns half, but the other half belongs to the other party, Yishava Shena B'Pachos Miravia. He takes a shvua that he owns not less than 1/4, and Zenoto Gimachalakim is Zenoto Revi. And each one takes half of the disputed part, which means that Ruvain ends up with 3/4 and Shimon ends up with 1/4. So that's the Mishnah. So the Bali Tosis, this is where we were, ask a question, and that is, what's the difference between this case and the case in Bava Basra? What is the case in Bava Basra? So if you have the Mar Makomos on page 1, it says here, Bavli, Bava Basra, Lamed Dalet Omid Beis. So the Gemara says, Hahu Arva, there was a certain boat, to have a Min Salah Betray, which was, the boat was subject to a conflict between two parties. Hi Omer Didihu, V'Hai Omer Didihu. Each one claimed that he owned the boat exclusively. Asachad Minayu. So it's very similar to Shnai Moksum Batalis, right? Two people claim that the whole object is theirs. Here too. Each one claims that the boat, that the object is his.
Yeah, but there's no muhsik here.
Right. So we'll see if that matters or not. That's what Bali Tos are going to discuss. So the Gemara says, Asachad Minayu Lebeidina. One came to Bezdin and said, V'Amar. This is very interesting, actually. Tifsu adamaisina sada didihi. The first case of the Gemara is that one of the parties came to Bezdin and said, listen, instead of applying, the psak of kol de alam gavar, that whoever, grabs it gets to keep it, I want you, Bezdin, to intervene, hold on to the object, because I'm going to bring evidence tomorrow, the next day. So in the meantime, if you could just, intervene and freeze, matters, that would be helpful. So does Bezin get involved in that kind of thing or not? Very interesting question.
Is it not true that even when you have kol dolam gova, if later on somebody brings evidence, the bezin would take away from the person?
Yes.
So why does he have to say this?
Because the Rajbam on the spot says that we're worried that in the interim, the person who grabs it will sell it to somebody else. And then you're going to have a whole legal mess, that it's not just taking away from the, from the thief, it's taking away from an innocent who also spent money acquiring it from the thief. So in order to avoid all of that, that's how Rajbam explains it. So we prefer not to get into complications. So we're asking Bezin for like a stay, I guess you would call it, to
There a
intervene.
time
And
limit? Is there a time limit to that period? Yeah,
that's a great question.
hold
I mean,
on.
what happened? The Gemara says that if that didn't work out, it doesn't say what the time. I guess Bezin would have a time period that they would impose, but there's no objective time period that I'm aware of. So this is what happened. So the Gemara wants to know, will Bezin intervene or not? Tafsinan olo tafsidan. Will Bezin grab the object and hold on to it, hoping that there will be a clarification of Edim or not? So the Gemara says, Rav Huna Mar Tafsinan. Rav Huna said that Bezin will grab it. Rav Yudah Mar Lo Tafsinan, that Bezin will not. Okay, the argument, I'm going to leave this for another time to discuss what this argument is. Rajbam has a reading, Tosas has a reading, not for now. So the Gemara says, Ozal v'lo ashkach sadeh. The guy, he made a big claims that he had witnesses and that, everything would be resolved. So let's say he can't bring the witnesses. Time period goes by and Bezin says, listen, you haven't brought the witnesses. So that's the next line in the Gemara. Ozal v'lo ashkach sadeh. Time went by and he didn't bring witnesses. So Omer lahu, so then they said to Bezdin, Afkuo, the called Alam Gavar. So forget about the Tvisa, release it to chaos, release it to, and let us fight it out to see who will get the object. So the Gemara says,
Isn't Rav Huna's opinion in the Machlokas more logical because Kol Elam Gava in itself is an indication that Bezin washing its hands of the whole matter.
So
therefore,
so that would be a reason for Tvisa, or a reason for not Tvisa?
Reason for not, reason to basically say we're not,
Well, that mean Rav Yehuda.
Yeah, Rav Yehuda, yeah.
Yeah, so I think yes, but on the other hand, since the guy claims that he has evidence, so if there is going to be real evidence, you can seek real justice. So the idea that somehow by freezing the situation you could get a better resolution, that's appealing to Bezdin, for the same reason, because they prefer. It's not like when we discuss it more fully, we're going to discuss, because they're really tabling. They're saying, you know what, hold off on the Kol Dalam Gavar. Let's try for Adim. That's appealing if you think Kol Dalam Gavar isn't such a mitzvah, right?
Right. In other words, Kol Dalam Gavar is only because they have
nothing else to do.
No hope of finding any resolution.
Right. Although we'll see that the Rush, we're not going to see it right now, but that the Rush in Bamatzia, in Basra, and in Achuva tries to provide a kind of rationale, what people call a birur rationale for Kol Dalam Gava. Which is very interesting.
The person with the real ownership rights is going to try harder to and eventually succeed.
Right.
Because it's his.
He has like two or three.
There's a greater attachment to the
person whose justice is on his side. Has more adrenaline. He's more. Well, he has, it's his, so he's more adamant about it. It's more
unless the mob is on the other side or something.
He's a crusader. Exactly. He's more of a crusader. Also, he says the other fellow is not going to expend as much energy because he knows the other guy could always bring Adam, maybe in the end. You might lose it. So if it's an easy mark, great.
In other words, the investment is a dangerous investment for the person who doesn't have the truth on his side because he could be putting money and effort into getting it.
Something which he might lose anyway because the other guy's really has, he might have evidence at some point. So but we'll discuss that. We'll discuss that. But most people do not look at Kol Dalam Gavar as a birur, as something which has, some sort of objective basis for it. They see it more as we don't want paralysis in the court system or in the legal system. So there has to be some sort of way to, break this deadlock. So if it isn't the psak of Bezdin, it's like Bezdin washing their hands of the situation, saying, listen, we don't have a basis to make this psak, but we also don't want to leave things in limbo. So, whoever comes up with it is going to be able to keep it for now. Again, you'll see the Gemara in Bava Basra, seems to say that one of the conditions for Kol Dalam Gavar is Ika Lebekim Allah de Milsa, which means there's still a possibility that there's evidence out there and that you'll be able, to prove it. So in a way, some people explain, I certainly suggest this, but I'm not sure if I'm imposing it but certainly it fits in with some of the interpretations that Kol Dalam Gavar is not a permanent solution, but it can be an interim solution. And therefore it's only applies when it's Ika Lemekim Allah de Milsa. Ika Lemekim Allah de Milsa means, we'll see in a moment, that it's possible that evidence, will be found.
Surface.
So then Kol Dalam Gavar isn't so bad because you need to be able to move on, but it's not the final, disposition of the case. Kol Dalam Gavar is it's like a very fascinating thing. We don't normally think that Judaism, that the halacha, would be supportive of a resolution that is based on power.
Also undermines the social.
Might makes. We don't believe in might makes right, for sure, and we're very idealistic, and very pacifistic, unless we have to be, physically active. But the idea of disputes between fellow Jews being solved in a physical way is really not so much in the ruach. I always give the example. It's a very fascinating thing that the tour begins Choshen Mishpat, Jewish civil law, by quoting the comments of Rabbi Yonah in his commentary on Avos. Why is that important? So in the beginning of Avos, I've mentioned this in the past, I'm pretty sure, the Rabbi Yonah discusses the difference between two Mishnayos, Al Shlosh Dvarim Ha'olam Omed and Al Shlosh Dvarim Ha'olam Kaya. So the idea is that Omed refers to the deeper purpose, the telos, the final cause, meaning there are three things that make the world worthwhile. And that, of course, is Torah, Voda, Gemilas, Chasad. Then there are three things that make the world, according to that Girsa, Kayam. That's not the purpose of the world, but they're what keep the world functional. Without these things, the world would fall apart. That's not the goal of the world, but it's the necessary, foundations of the world. What is that? Emes, Din, and Shalom, right? Truth, law, and peace. So it's very interesting. Rabbi Yonah, when he explains the difference between Kayam and Omed, that, Kayam is functional and Omed is purposive. So he, explains that din, without law, Ishas Chavero Chayim Bla'o.
That's
People swallow each other up. What?
Pirkei Avos points that out.
I'm talking about Pirkei Avos. Yeah, I mean, also specifically, but right. So he says that's the pshat in Pirkei Avos, that Olam is Kayam. One of the reasons is din together with Emes and Shalom. So why am I telling you this? When the tour wrote his commentary on Jewish civil law and Choshen Mishpat, so he begins, his introduction is a quotation of Rabbi Yonah on Avos on this point, but he expands beyond what we have in our text of Rabbi Yonah. So when he wants to make the point that without law, the world would be chaotic and, people would swallow each other up and there would be no basis for any kind of, tranquil society. So what he says is, without law, Ishas Chaveru Chaim Bla'o, people would swallow each other up. And he said, and not only that, you'd have a kind of a law that was based on Kol Da'alim Gavar. It's very interesting. Kol Da'alim Gavar means whoever is.
I thought Kol Da'alim Gavar is a civilized resolution. I thought it's not. I thought it's a civilized way to resolve things.
It's not so civilized. I mean, it's
we talked about this. We had 2 weeks of. I thought it was a fist fight, and you explained to me that no, the guy is hungrier, fights more.
No. I said that the Rush explains that there's a birur involved. That's what I just mentioned again. According to the Rush, he's hungrier, he has more adrenaline, he has more to he's more willing to invest because it's his, and therefore he's more attached to it. And also the other fellow is less invested because he knows he can lose it through evidence anyway. So it's what I explained is that it's not arbitrary. According to the Rush, there is reason to rely on it. It's still strange, right, that any dispute is going to be solved in a physical way, right? That remains. So what I'm trying to show is that the irony here is the Tur was the son of the Rush, right? His name was Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher. His father, Rabbeinu Asher, wrote the Rush, and he had a few accomplished, quite a few accomplished sons, but the most famous of which was his son Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbeinu Yaakov, and he wrote the Tur. He's the Balaturim. When you see all those interesting gematrias, they're all from the son of the Rush. And when you read the Tur, which is the foundation of the Shulchan Aruch is based on the Tur, right? That's the son of the Rush. So it's interesting that even though the Rush is the one who, more than any other Rishon, I wouldn't say, made it more civilized, but made it less arbitrary, called Alam Gavar. Nonetheless, he doesn't mean it in the case of where it's the law. He means it as an expression. But when he wants to use an expression to show lawlessness, right, he says called Alam Gavar, which is interesting. Anyway, this is the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Hechad de Tafa. The Gemara says, what's the story about Tfisa and Mafkinan? Amalu Afkua. So he says, listen, if the Bezin holds on to the object and then the other fellow can't bring witnesses, what do you do then? So the answer is they both say, release it to Kol Dalim Gavar, Afku of Kol Dalim Gavar. So the Gemara says, Mafkinan alone, does Bezin do that or not? Because once something is in the hands of Bezdin, they may not be able to release it to Kol Dalim Gavar. That's not a psak of Bezdin. Bezdin has a greater responsibility to ensure, that, things go to their proper place. So it's one thing for Bezdin to say, we can't help you, but this is the way to solve your dispute, called Alam Gavar. But once it's in their jurisdiction, can they release it to
what
a
makes
state?
what makes it in their jurisdiction?
If tafsu, if they took it.
In other words, the fact that they have a possession factor makes it part of Bezin's jurisdiction.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what the Gemara wants to know. If there's tvisa, do we say mafkinan or lo mafkinan? Can they just release it? Like, okay, fine, it didn't work out. We're throwing it back on the ground and letting them, solve their dispute this way. Or once Bezin took a role in all of this, so then the standards, that becomes a victim of their own standards. There are things that, the Bezdin can allow informally, that you can say, listen, we can't solve this problem. We have very high standards. There's not enough evidence. Solve it this way. But once they put their imprimatur on it, once they're involved in it, once it comes into their physical possession, maybe their standards make it difficult, to revert to.
Is that what this is about, or is it about the fact that each one of them actually has a claim, a solid claim? They're holding on to it. In other words,
well, they're not holding on to it. We're talking about the case of the boat.
Oh, so you're talking about the case of the talus in comparison.
No. We're going to get back to talus in a minute. We're not talking about the talus. We're talking about the boat.
There's no way to hold on to a boat.
Yeah, no one's holding on to the boat. They're just both have legal claims.
They both missed the boat.
Exactly. Each one missed the boat, or each one doesn't want to miss the boat.
So how does Bezdin have a tefisa, so to speak, on this situation? If
Meaning Bezdin, it's under Bezdin's protection that no one can grab it and no one can sell it in the interim. If they took that path, can they now say, okay, guys, that didn't work. Adam didn't show up. Let's go back to where we were. Or once they get involved, does that raise the ante, and you can no longer go back to what happened beforehand? Because now it's like, once it enters into the jurisdiction of Bezdin, then different standards take over. That's a very interesting question.
Even though Bezdin made its
Sure.
entry because of a false statement made by one side.
Yeah. So the Ramban has a line in which he says, that according to the one that says that we can release it to a Kol Dalam Gavar, maybe the way to explain it would be to say that Bezdin's involvement was like a mistake. It was a tos, because it was on the basis of the claim that the other guy was going to bring witnesses, which he didn't bring. So it's not so much that Bezdin's releasing it to a new state of chaos, as much as they're undoing their tfisa because they're saying it was based on
status ante, so to speak, right?
Yeah, because they're saying that the whole thing was based on
Factual
a false.
lie, basically.
They were tricked or they were misled. That's how the Ramban says it, but others don't necessarily see it that way. So there's a question.
Is that a function of Brera?
No, 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 no. Brera is when something unfolds.
Flip side of Brera, no?
No, not really. This is really I mean, they did something in a way. You could
Had
say
they known when the guy came in that it was a false statement he was making,
but they knew it could be.
They would never have undertaken this.
They knew it could be. In a way, it's like a risk, risk reward kind of a thing. Meaning, there's a mechanism in place to solve this problem called Olam Gaba. The question is, are they going to interfere with that on the possibility of resolving it in a better way, a more ideal way? But if they do that, they might get stuck because once it comes into their jurisdiction, maybe the present resolution is no longer an option. So then it's a risk reward. On the one hand, they're taking a chance. They're taking, they're shooting for a touchdown, let's say.
Does everyone agree that Kol Olam Nogava is not a preferred method, or do some say that it's nothing wrong with that method? Or is there agreement from everybody that it's the least desirable method?
No, there is some discussion about it, but if it's to the extent that it's desirable, it's not because of the substance of it, it's because of the informality of it. You know what I'm saying? Meaning its weakness is also its strength. And then some people just think that, it's more of a strength than a weakness. Meaning if I can't attain justice at the highest level, so then it might be preferable not to involve Bezdin
Than
at
to make
all.
a bad decision.
Yeah, exactly. We that's in a way it's like midrabanan we call it zilusa de bedina, but it's a derived idea too, meaning we don't want to compromise the integrity, the stature, and thereby undercut the effectiveness of the Bezdin.
It's also a bit of Shebal Tasa, no?
So in a way,
no
by
harm,
saying,
as the medical profession would say.
Yeah, do no harm, meaning we can't solve this, so it's better that we stay out of it, because if we can't solve it, but we get involved, it tarnishes really our reputation and our standards. So in that sense, it might be, preferred in a certain way, but it's not preferred because solving things through might is ever preferred. It's because of the informality of, not compromising the standards of Bezdin. That might make it preferable. Okay. Anyways, so the Gemara finally says, what's the halacha in this Gemara? The Gemara says, "V'hilchasa lo tafsinan, the heicha the tafas lo mafkinan." The actual halacha is that Bezdin should not get involved in this, even with the promise of Edom to begin with. But if they do, then and they do grab onto the object, they can't release it back into a state of Kol Dalam Gava. That's the psak. Then the Gemara says, what's this whole Kol Dalam Gava? Where did it come from even? So it's a little bit backwards, but then the Gemara has the case. Zeomer shalavosai. Omer shalavosai. Each one says, the object belonged to my father. They didn't have the same father, right? So Amar Rav Nachman, Kol the Alim Gavar Whoever is stronger, he wins. Okay. Then the Gemara in Bava Basra says, how come here we're paskening in this case of the Arva, the boat, called Alam Gavar, but there are other cases where we pasken Yachloku or we pasken Shuda Daina. So that's the Gemara's continuation. The Gemara says, how come when two people show up in court with a contract, that that seems to establish them as the owner of a piece of land or real estate, but two contracts establish two different people at the same time as the owner of the same real estate, right? As Ruvain and Shimon each show up in court with a star mecher or a star matana, saying that they are the owners of a certain field. So the Gemara says about that's called shtei shtaros, two contracts, hayotzim b'yamechad, that appear on the same day, that appear equally valid. The Rav Amar Yachloku, Ushmuel Amar Shuda Dedaini. So Rav says you split the field because the two people each has a contract. Each seems to have been sold the field at the same time, and therefore, if a person sells an object to two different people simultaneously, then each one acquires half of the object.
Is that following Simchas?
No, nothing to do with Simchas. This probably has to do with the Gemara says it has to do with the position of Rabbi Meir that Eidei Chasima Karsi, and therefore the Chasima Sa'edim only begins when there's a lack of ambiguity in the transaction, and that means at the same time, and therefore this is not Mamon Mutab Safek. It's not a Safek. It's a Vada. It's like you sold. They didn't know about it necessarily, but it's like you sold one property to two, or you gave a present, one property to two different people at the same time, and therefore it's split by definition. That's not.
Because it could have been earlier or later in the day, but we don't put the hour of the day on the star.
Yeah, exactly. The absence of the hour of the day makes the transaction time irrelevant. According to the Mandamar, Chasima Karsi. That's what I meant by that idea, Rabbi Meir.
And what do we do to the person who sold two contracts on the same day to two different people?
Are we happy with that person?
No, could he be punished somehow?
Well, it could also be a case where he gifted the same to two people. It's obviously not a good thing, but it's his property, so. Assuming if he took full payment, if he sold it and he took full payment, then he's liable to return the money. You're totally right in your question. Let's make it less complicated. And let's say he gifted two people at the same time. So there's no fraudulent monetary issue, right? He didn't do anything, that, that was financial.
No personal gain.
Right. He didn't steal from anybody. Let's say he had a property and he had two best friends, could have decided, between them, and he gave them each the property without telling them that he gave it to the other one. Right. Again, I don't think it's a great, thing to do. But either way, he's gifting property. So the psak, according to Rav, based on the view of Rabbi Meir, is that each one is entitled to half of this property. But that's not a suffix. It's not out of doubt. It's that's the conclusion of this, legal sale, simultaneous sale without telling people, assuming again that there's no fraud, there's no payment. He's not getting double payment. That we wouldn't tolerate, of course. Okay, good. What does Shmuel say? Shmuel says Shuda Dedaini. What is Shuda Dedaini? So the words mean, you like throw it to the judges. But again, we'll talk about it more. The idea is somehow that the judges get to decide. That's part of the problem.
Judicial intuition?
So mostly it's a kind of judicial intuition. Like who do they really think, was the intended recipient of the field.
Now they're going to do a cross-examination of the two parties, no?
Yeah, or the history of the owner and these two people. Like sometimes it can be there's no evidence, but there's a compelling case can be made. He knew this guy forever. He just met the other guy, yesterday. The history between these two people is a good history. The other one is, the other one may have strong armed him. He has a reputation, for.
But according to Shmuel, they're doing basically the opposite of Kol Dolam Gava approach. They're putting their neck out
Yes.
on the line
Yeah.
when they shouldn't.
Yeah. So anyway, that's true. But the Gemara is asking, how come in the boat case it's called Alam Gavar, and in the simultaneous sale to two people, it's either Yachloko or Shuda the Daini. So listen to the answer of the Gemara. The Gemara says the following. This is what I was referring to before. Hasam Leika Lemeka Malada Milsa. In the case of the two people who were sold the same property, simultaneously or legally simultaneously, Leika Lemeka Malada Milsa. There's nothing more to find out because it's the facts really establish. There's nothing beyond these facts that is legally consequential. So,
and no one is lying.
Yeah, no one's lying. But Hocha Ika Lemeka Malada Milsa. In the case of Kol Dalam Gavar, there's still a possibility of being Mavarer, what happened. So, what kind of factor is that?
Actually,
Rabbi, may I ask something?
Sure.
Because this is
Sure.
what are you saying? The ship is in the midst of the sea?
No, the ship is just an example.
Because then it would be Proverbs 30. If the ship is floating, does anybody bring in Proverbs 30 here?
I hear you, but no. It just so happens they give other examples too.
Okay.
So it's just it's an example of a disputed property, but I hear you.
Okay.
But Shmuel's view seems to elevate Kol Dolam Gava to a high plateau.
Well, this isn't called down go. Should mean Shuda.
Should I rather, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what's the second question? You asked about Sumchas. So the Gemara continues. What's the difference between the Kol Alam Gavar case, boat or other case, doesn't matter, and the following? A machlif para b'chamar, the yolda. Let's say I exchange my cow for your donkey. And neither of us are present, when the cow is exchanged, behold, and then the cow gives birth. So we're not sure whether or not the birth took place prior to or after the kinyan, or same case with a shifcha. So the dispute centers around the question of the timing of this birth. Was the birth before or after the transaction? If it was before the transaction, so it's not included in the transaction. If it was after the transaction, so it was part of the animal, and it is included. So what did we say? Yachloku. So there we say Yachloku, and here we say in the boat case, we say called Alam Gavar. What's the difference?
Isn't
So
it
the
the
Gemara
same
said
answer?
What?
Same answer you said before. One, we can't find out any further evidence.
No, because here you can't also. It's
We don't know. We're never gonna know when Bessie had the calf.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, unless somebody, turns up, who happened to see it and can testify about it.
Stopwatch or something.
Yeah. But okay, I hear. It's interesting the Gemara didn't give that answer. Here the Gemara gives a different answer. Hasam lahai is dror de mamona ulahu islay dror de mamona. Hacha idamar lo damar. So the Gemara says in the case of the dispute, zeomar shalavosai, each one said it belonged to my father. So these are mutually exclusive claims, and the claim is all that there is. Without the claim, like there is no reason, to ascribe this object to, either one of these parties. But when it comes to the Vlad, when it comes to the child, there's drora de mamona to each one. What is drora de mamona? Let's take the Balitosis interpretation for now. Tosa says drora de mamona means below tainoseim yesafek lebez, meaning even if no one came to court, no one knew what happened. Let's say the two parties don't know, right? Because they weren't there either. But each one doesn't need to claim objectively. We can claim for them because each one is connected equally, but positively to this Vlad. Because, Ruvain is the previous owner and Shimon is the present owner. And the child was born sometimes, sometime either in the, either in the end of the past ownership or in the beginning of the present ownership. So that's called drora de mamona. Tosa says drora de mamona means below tanoseim yesh safek lebez, meaning you don't need their claim to understand that there's a possibility that it belongs, that these are candidates for ownership of this disputed object. Just, that's what it is. It just objectively.
The flip side is that neither one of them can really make a claim. They don't have no idea.
Right. That one of the things that the Gemara points out here in Bab Metzia, when the Gemara asks a similar question, is that it's possible that the case of Sumchos, that's an argument, is only b'shema, not even b'bari bari, meaning even, they don't know themselves. But there's still a question, who the object belongs to, and there's still a basis for each one's, being the owner, right? So that's called drora de mamona. Okay, so that's our Gemara.
By the way, the Gemara doesn't entertain that we go back to the last cheskas. The last.
That's the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan disagree with Sumchas because they say we go by the Marakam. But
the last person that had obvious possession of.
Yeah, so that's the Rabbanan, but Sumchas disagrees. So that's the Gemara called Alam Gavar. So what's interesting is in our Gemara, also the Gemara says, how can you say Achloku? Why don't you say Yehi Munach Ad Sheyavo Eliyahu? Keep it in limbo. And why don't you say Sumchas? And why don't you say Amotzi Mechaveru Alavarai? And the Gemara gives all sorts of answers. Then you have the Gemara in Bava Basra and called Alam Gavar, and the Gemara asks about Shuda, and the Gemara asks about Achloku, and the Gemara asks about Sumchas. But the Rishonim are the ones who ask, going back to Tosas now in Bava Metzia, that what's the difference between our Mishnah of Yachloku and the Kol Dalam Gavar case? The Gemara doesn't ask that question, right? But Tosas asks that question.
But in general, you can ask that question about all four approaches. Why does the Gemara choose this for this and this for that?
Right, exactly. So it's interesting that the question about Kol Dalam Gavar and Yachloku really became the catalyst for trying to answer all four questions, like to try to figure out what are the rules of engagement here. Like, what are the rules that determine when you say we're going to keep this in limbo, when you say we're going to split it with a shvua, without a shvua, when you say we're going to do shuda de daini, and when you say we're going to do Kol Dalam Gavar. What are the rules? So that if you look at the Rishonim, the Ramban, the Rimigash and Bava Basra, the Ramban and Bava Basra and Bava Metzia, the Chidush Aran and Bava Metzia, they came up with, based on their analysis of these conflicting Gemaras and the commentaries that surround them, they came up with a whole, presentation of how do you solve a dispute when you don't have witnesses or an admission, right? And that they have rules. So the rules come from these Gemaras. Okay, so let's talk about some of the Rishonim about when do you say Achloku, when do you say Kol Alam Gavar? So our printed Tosas, going back to Tosas on base Amud Aleph for a minute, second Tosas, asks this question, says, Tema, Mai Shno Me'ayida Arva. What's the difference? Why here do we say Shnai Mosa B'talas Yachloku? And in Bava Basra, we say called Alam Gavar. The Amar called the Alam Gavar, Parakaskas Abat. So what's the answer? It's the answer that you gave right from the beginning. But it could be you had, advanced intelligence. So this is the most popular answer in the Rishonim, but even this popular answer is understood in different ways. And that's one of the things I want to show. The Shlomar, the Ochzin Shiny. The difference is that the boat case in Bava Basra, neither party is holding on to the boat. Right? The boat is sitting there. Or it can be any object that's sitting there. It doesn't have to be a boat. Ochzin Shiny. But the case in Bava Metzia, at least in the Mishnah, is Shnayim Ochzin Batalis. Two people are holding on to the edge of a single object. So here, two people are holding, and there no one's holding. Well, what's the difference? Why does that matter? So here, you could say one of two things. You could say, well, as long as somebody's holding, even if both are holding, you can't say Kol Alam Gavar. Because if that's all we wanted to do is to explain why you don't say Kol Alam Gavar, we could say it in a very minimalist way. We could say that when two people hold on to an object, you can't take it away from either of them, and you can't take it away from them collectively, just like you can't take it away necessarily from Besdin and say, okay, we're going to restart and say Kol Alam Gavar. You can't initiate Kol Alam Gavar. So if people are holding on to it, you're not going to say Kol Alam Gavar.
Is there
Maybe
further?
that's what Rashi has in mind. Rashi, if you look at the first Rashi in Bava Metzia, Rashi says Shnayim Ochzin Batalis, Dafka Ochzin, only if they're holding on, the Shneim Muchsakim Ba. But that doesn't, and then he goes on to say, if one was holding on, you'd say Motzim Bechavero, Olav, Araya, he would win completely. But Tosas goes way further than that. Look at what Tosas says. Tosas says, Yesh Lomar to Ochzin Shiny, not just therefore you can't take it away and do Kol Alam Gavar, but the choshev, it's considered ilu kol echad yeshlo bivadai hachetzi. Okay, them is big words. It's as if each one certainly is holding on exclusively to half of the object. If two people are holding on to the edge of an object, is it obvious that each one is legally holding on by himself to half of the object? No. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying it's not true. Tosas is saying it's true. But I'm saying, is it obvious? Certainly not. But that's what Tosas says. What's it based on? The answer is based on the Gemara on Gimel Amud Aleph. This is a quote. This should be in quotations. The next few words I'm reading from Tosas. You wouldn't know this unless you knew the Gemara, right? The Anansadi means we are witnesses, meaning the world is witnesses. When somebody's holding on to something, it's perfectly clear. That's what the words mean. The Mai Detafis Hai Didehu, that whatever he's holding on to is his. That line appears in the Gemara.
Holding the edge, or is he holding the whole half?
He's holding the edge.
So still the question remains.
Even if he was holding half and the other guy was holding half, I'm not so sure I would use the expression.
But surely, if he's holding the edge, we didn't answer any question that you had before.
So this is now what's fascinating about this is that the Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph that Tosas quotes is actually a very surprising proof that the Gemara wants to bring. I'm going to show you what the proof is in just a second. And that on Dalet Amud Aleph, right? I looked ahead, so I know I have some advanced intelligence. On Dalet Amud Aleph, the Gemara goes back to what it said on Gimel Amud Aleph and says, remember that proof you brought from the Mishnah and the Anan Sadi? That can't be accurate, can it? For the following reason, and the Gemara rejects it. So even though the Gemara rejected it, Tosas quotes it, continues to quote it. Wow. Okay, I'm going to show you that.
Power also, no?
What?
Havaminas have some power also.
Yeah, I think that's. I always say that. This is an excellent proof of that. Tosas,
Rabbi,
yeah.
May I impose 30 seconds here? This is very big for me.
Okay.
I think it has to do with the letter Yud. Yud, Vav, Dalet. Okay? Now, the two people are not the same here. It says Zay has half, and the other person is Zay has half. It's not Zay and Zay.
It's
I
Zeh,
mean,
Zeh,
Zay,
Zeh Omer
Zay.
and Zeh Omer. Zeh just means this one.
Yeah, yes, this one, but the second one means Vzay. Vza.
Well, in regular Hebrew, it just means the vav
No,
here
but
is
here's
less
my
than
point. Here's my
half.
point. Let me just say my point. The first one has a yud. The second
No.
one has a vav dalet, the completion of the letter yud. And so both of them have 10 to make the 20 of the yud. And so
Well-
both of them have half. If you consider, I look at the text, and it's vav Zion Hey. The first
Yeah,
one
but
is Zion Hey, and the second one is Vav Zion Hey.
right. But
And-
that's the way in any Hebrew, whether it's modern or ancient, that you would say A and B.
Well,
So
this is
I
my
understand
point.
you want to read it in a mystical
Well,
way,
because they're right.
right?
I'm
I'm just saying
only
this is the
saying-
normal way. You might want to read something in a mystical way if it's written in a way that's incompatible to be reading it in a natural way. But this is the natural way. When you say
Well, I'm showing how
Zeh,
they have. I'm showing how they each have half. One has
No.
a yud, and the other has Vav Dalet.
right, but so I'm going to show you the Gemara in a minute, which
Okay.
says that in this
Thank
case,
you. Thank you.
yeah, I'm going to show you in
Thank
a minute, but this case is a case where each one's holding on to the edges. They're not really holding on to actually half. It's legally
Yeah.
half, but it's not. Okay. So, so let me show you what I just said. Where does this come from? So look at the Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph for a minute. And look at two dots towards the bottom, like the bottom quarter of the page. Everybody have that?
Rabbi,
Yeah, Tani Rabbi. We'll get to it at the right time. But for now, just an amazing thing that Tosas quotes this. Tani Rabbi, this is about Moda B'miktsas. So Moda B'miktsas means when a person admits that if I accuse you of stealing from me, well, I don't say it's stealing. I accuse you of owing me $100, right? Or I charge that you owe me $100. And let's say you respond and you say, I only owe
Half.
half, 50. So that's, but the other half I don't know. So that's called Moda B'miktsas Hataina, admitting part. And you have to pay what you admit that you owe. And you have to take an oath, a shvua, on the rest. That's a shvua daraisa. That's a biblical shvua called Moda B'miktsas. But what happens in the following case? Let's say you didn't admit anything. Let's say I said to you, you owe me $100. You said, I don't owe a penny. That's called kofar hakol. But let's say there's also Adim, there are witnesses who can't testify about the 100, but they can testify about 50. Right? So that's the din of Rabbi Chia. Tani Rabbi Chia, Mono li biyadecha, you owe me $100. Allah omer ein lecha biyadi klum. The other guy says, I don't owe you anything. The ha'edim me'idim also sheyesh lo chamishim zuz. And the witnesses come and they say,
he ever got the loan, or could he be saying that he paid it back already?
either way.
That's the case. What the Adam say doesn't have any consequence. They may have seen him borrow 50. He may
No,
be
so they say they support that there's an obligation of 50.
Okay.
Either they say, we saw that he that he lent 50, or they come to court and they say we know for a fact that we've been following around and that 50 was never paid, right? Assuming that part isn't a problem, right? Okay, so the witnesses support half the claim only. They don't deny the other part. They just don't weigh in on the other part, right? So this is called Rab Chia din. So the din is nosen v'chamishim zuz v'shava alasha. Wow. Even though they're not modeh b'miktsas, even though he's not a modeh b'miktsas taina, he's not admitting on half of the taina. From his point of view, he's called for bakol. But since there are adim, there are witnesses that establish, right, a chiyuv b'miktsas, even though it's not a hodah b'miktsas, it's a chiyuv b'miktsas, an obligation on 50%. That still triggers a chiyuv shvua on the rest. Okay, we're going to talk about it when we get to it, but that's the din of Rabbi Chia. What's
And
the reasoning
what's
behind it?
surprising about that?
What's the reasoning behind it?
Why is that a chiddush?
Why is it a chiddush?
Why is
Because
that
the
surprising?
case, well, because the case in the Gemara, the case in the paradigm case is where he admits 50%.
This is worse because he was caught in a lie.
Well, that's what the Gemara says. So the next line of the Gemara wants to explain it. It says, "Shalote hodos piv gedola me'ados edim mikal v'chol," which means if when he admits, that triggers a shvu on the rest, then certainly when edim come and support 50% of the claim, that should trigger a shvu on the rest. But it's not so obvious, but that's the reasoning. So far, what does this have to do with artosis? Listen to the next line. The Gemara says, "Vatana tuna." Tanatuna means that we can bring an evidence to this idea. We can prove from the Mishnah of Shnaim Oksin the din of Rabbi Chia. That what? That if edim are made on mikza sachiyuv, that triggers a shvua on the rest. What's the proof? Shnayim Oksin betalis. Two people are holding on to a talis. Ze omar ni mitzasiya v'chulei. Fine. Bahacha, says the Gemara, even the toughest, since each one is holding on, right? Anan Sahadi, does it sound familiar? These are the words of Tosas. Anan Sahadi, we attest to the fact that my the toughest high didehu, umay the toughest high didehu, that whatever each one, is, since our two people holding on, it's as if each one we know for a fact, like we have Adim on 50%. And if we have Adam on 50%, that explains Uktani Yishava.
But they're not swearing equally. They're not swearing on the other half. They're only swearing on a quarter extra.
No. This is the first case of Mishnah.
Oh.
They're swearing on 50. But either way, it's a terrible proof. Why is it a terrible proof? So look on Dalit. But you see, okay.
A little circular reason.
One second, you'll see why it's terrible proof in a minute. But this is where Tosas got the line. The Gemara quoted the Mishnah to say that when each person is holding on, it's as if there's edus, like Rabbi Chia type edus, that he owns 50. It's like our Edom who came to court and said 50% belongs to him. And we know that there's a chiyuv shvua on the rest. Each one imposes a chiyuv shvua on the other for the rest.
We're doing this based on a concept of rove that in almost all cases when this happens.
Wait, so why? One second. So that's where Tosas got the line that when each person's holding on, it's as if we know, like with evidence, that each person's a 50% owner from this Gemara. Now look at Dalid Omud Aleph for a minute.
Which says, what were you thinking?
Exactly. The Gemara in Dalid Omud Aleph
Where?
It says Betana Tuna Shnaim Oksim Betalis. You see where it says, in mine at least, it says Rashal on the right side of
the. Right. Yeah.
So on the line on top of that.
Right.
So it goes like this.
Tosas,
here Tosas is analyzing. Tosas says, remember that proof we brought on Gimel Amud Aleph, right? Vitana Tuna Shnaim Oksim Betalis, right? Bahacha kiva the toughest. Anan sadi the toughest. Oh, I'm sorry. I take it back. It goes to the Tanatuna on top. No. I got too late in the Gemara because I was excited to give you a.
Is that? I see. Ella de Koma Tanatuna in the middle.
1 second. Here. A couple lines on top. Ella de Koma.
Down the Tosas Vitona.
Ella de Koma. You have that?
Yeah, the Koma right in the middle almost of the page.
Yeah, it's like 50% down the page. Sorry, I went too far. The words Hazamala Parach in the beginning of the line.
Right. Yeah.
So listen to this. The Gemara says, Ella de Ka'amar v'tana tura. By the way, says the Gemara, the proof that you brought for Rabbi Chia from the Mishnah in Bab Metzia, me dummy. Can you compare those two? Can you compare the holding, two people holding on to a talis you're saying that that is the equivalent of having Shnayim Edim supporting half of the claim? Hasam Lamalva Islay Sahade, Lalova Leslay Sahade. In the case of Rabbi Chia, there's only one set of Edim. Right? What happens in the case of Rabbi Chia? Ruvain says, you owe me $100. Shimon says, I don't owe you anything. And then there are witnesses that 50% back up Ruvain, right? That's what the Gemara means when it says, in the case of Rabbi Chia, midami, hasam lemalva islay sahade, there's Edom support for the malva, lalova leislay sahade. Lova doesn't have any evidence to anybody supporting him at all.
Why don't we say that half are supporting the Lova?
One second, because he's claiming the lo masik the lo midi. The avale sade lova, if the Lova had his own Edom, right? The lo masik lo midi, if he had people to back up his claim, if there were two Edom that came and said, you owe $50 to Reuven, and then Shimon said, I have Edom that show I don't owe a penny, and they came and they said the $50 that you claim that is owed, we contradict. That's called Eidos HaKasha. You wouldn't take a shua in that case, right? If there were Edom who said lo masik v'lo midi lo boy Rabbi Chia l'ishtabue, right? Hacha kihecha da anan sade bahai anan sade bahai.
I
But in
don't
the
see
case
anything so strong
in
because
the case of the Mishnah, each one, if you're going to follow through and suggest that this is really anan sadi, right?
But
then each one has an anan
Mishnah,
sadi.
each holding on to the talus claims the whole talus is theirs, correct?
Yes.
And
Are
therefore,
there tzitzis?
the
Are there
Anan
tzitzis
Sadi,
on the towers? Are there tzitzis on the towers or no?
Doesn't matter. No, it's not that kind of a talus. To hear
Okay.
talus just means
and the
it means a
Anan
beggar.
Sadi, so to speak, is the fact that each one is entitled to half. So really, the Edom there are not agreeing that anyone's telling the truth. Okay. Now here, when the Edom come and say it's $50, not 100, they're not
So
agreeing.
they don't
with
say 50, not 100. They say we know at least 50.
whatever, but at the moment, it's not agreeing with the Malva either. And
Yes, they are.
in a way, they're equally in the middle between the
No.
Malva and the Lova.
No. That's what I was telling you before. The Edom here are only helpful to the Malva. They say, listen, we don't know about the 100. We don't know. Yes, we don't know about 100. Not yes and not no, but we definitely know at least about 50. That's what they say. They're only supportive of the Malva. They're not. There's no downside for the Malva in what they say. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. In the case of the Mishnah, so what the Gemara is calling out is, how can you say that each one holding half the talus is anan sadi? Then you're saying that each side has witnesses. That can't be motive miktsas. By the way, it's connected to the Gemara's conclusion anyway, which is that the shvua of the Mishnah shvua d'oraisa of motive miktsas? No. The Gemara says it's based on the position of Rabbi Yochanan. We've seen this already.
People should grab everybody to tell us.
Again, talis here doesn't mean with tzitzis and all that. It means it's a cloth, basically. So it's it's a deterrent.
Societal provision to keep peace.
It's a deterrent. So isn't it fascinating that even though the Gemara
rejects
the raya, the Balei Tosas liked the formulation, right? And they just, kind of put quotations on it to prove their view, which is that Shnayim Ochsen Batalis is like 50% ownership, which is an amazing idea. Is it obvious that if two people, especially if they're holding on to the edges of a talus? Now, what do we say about the edges?
The whole issue was started here because we wanted to understand the difference between the case with the boat and the case with the talus.
Right.
There's an obvious difference. In one case, they're talking about what they each know. When each one says that my father owned this boat, that's not the same thing. Okay, I mean,
What do you mean?
They're not the party involved.
No. The next case on the Gemara is Zelmer Shali, Zelmer Shali. That's not a problem. Okay. So look at Hayomid base also just for a minute. Oh, we'll skip that. You know what? Let me go to Zion Amid Aleph for a minute, just to show you about the edges of the talus that I mentioned. I'm sorry we're jumping around a little bit. It'll help us later, hopefully.
We always do that. It's okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
So listen to this. This is a very interesting Gemara. This is also like in the middle of the page. Tani Rav Tachlifa Bar Marava Kamed Rabavo. You see there's a little dalet of the Rambam. Shnai Madukim Betalis.
I see the Gimel. Dalet Shnai Madukim, yeah.
Everybody have that? It's like the middle of the page.
It's to the right of the Im Yachol.
Im Yachol and Natko. The Tosas go down like 3-4 lines.
On the right,
and it's there, yeah. And it's a Os Dalet of the Rambam, you'll see. So Shnaim, listen to this. Shnaim Adukim Betalis, 2 people holding on to a talis. Sound familiar so far? But it gets different now. Zen notel ad mokom sheyodo magas. Zen notel ad mokom sheyodo magas. Each one takes the amount that he's holding on to. The hashar, and whatever they're not holding on to, holkim b'shava. I'll explain in a minute. Mach v'lei Rabavo made a sign, ubishvua. What happened here? Let's say one person is holding on to 35% of the talus. Ruvain's holding on to 35% of the talus. And Shimon is holding on to 15% of the talus. Right? Altogether, that's 50% of the talus. And there's nobody holding on to the rest because it's in the middle. So what the Gemara says is, Ruvain holding on to 35, he gets the 35. Shimon holding on to 15 gets the 15, and they split the remaining 50. So basically, that means 25 and 25. So Ruvain ends up with 60%, and Shimon ends up with 40%. Everybody with me?
And we don't think that Shimon the 35% should get a greater percentage of the unknown portion.
No, that we split. And the Gemara says ubishvua. What does the shvua go on? So if you look at Tosfos on the side, Tosfos says machvi lo rabavo v'hashar b'shvua nira de lo garsinan v'hashar ta'af lemeshe yadam agas yishava. Tosfos says there was an old girsa. This seems to be the girsa of the Rambam, as the Gra points out. There's an Os Aleph there that is the Gona Vilna, the Gra. He says, look at the Rambam disagrees. There's a girsa. This girsa said, you take a shvua, an oath on the 50%, but you don't take a shvua on the 35 and the 15% that the people are holding. And Tosa says that's wrong.
Claiming it's theirs completely?
Yes, exactly. Well, in the end, the Rambam says you take a shvua, what's called a Gilgul shvua. Since you're swearing on the other part, you get to swear on this part. But you shouldn't have to take a shvua on the part that you're physically controlling. And Tosas disagrees. Tosas says that's not a good girsa. On the whole, whatever you take, 60-40, so then that you swear 60, you swear 40. Keep going in the Gemara. You'll see in a moment what this is about. So the Gemara says, Elamas nisan diktani, the polgi badadi, v'loktani zenot al mokom shiada magas, echem ishkachasla. Our Mishnah in Shnai Mosen doesn't say anything about ad shiada magas. It says that you split the talus 50-50. Right? Here we're saying that if somebody's holding on to 35%, somebody's holding on to 50%, and neither are holding on to the other 50%, it's 60-40. Or whatever the scenario is, it could, depending on what they're holding on to, right?
So what's the difficulty?
How come our Mishnah says 50%?
But they both are saying the same thing. They're saying that the portion that they're not holding on.
Oh, so 1 second, because you already know the answer. This is where the answer was stated.
Logical.
No, so the Gemara says, Amra Papa de Tfisi Bikarkashta. The Mishnah is not a case where you're holding on to the actual parts of the talus. In the Mishnah, they're holding on to the edge. Each one's holding on to the edge. So the whole talus is split. The whole talus is like the shar. Correct? So now, then the Gemara says another thing, one more line. Amrav Masharshi, Shmamina Hai Sudra, Kivin de Tafas, Gimel al Gimel, Karina Bevinasan Lareyeu, de Kiman de Pasuk Dami Vikani. Wow. They say the following. When you make a Kinyan Sudar is a mode of acquisition, a method of transferring an object or title, right? Like we do at a wedding, right? So you hold on to the object. Like the rabbi says, hold on to the pen, or hold on to
Like when you sell the chametz.
Yeah, when you sell your chametz, right? So you're holding on to a handkerchief or something. So the Gemara, this is the Gemara that said, do you have to hold on to the whole handkerchief? Do you have to like bunch up the whole thing in your hand? And what if the other guy's holding on to the other part? It's really supposed to be Kalev Shel Kona, right? So how does that work? So the Gemara says, as long as you're holding on, the person who has to be holding on to 3 by 3 fingers, which is halachically the minimum for a beged in Hilchos Kalim and Tuma,
Shouldn't be a patch. Yeah.
then it says it doesn't matter that somebody else is holding on to the rest of it, because the part that you're holding on to is a beged. Command the pasuk dami. What does that have to do with what we were just talking about? Because the Gemara just explained that in a dispute, if you're holding on to the part, the part that you're holding on to, you get that amount. If you're holding on to more than he is, you'll get more than he will get. Right? So that's what the Gemara says, Shema Mino. We see from there that physical control of the object is command to pasuk dami. So this is the question I want to pose. In the Gemara, there are 2 levels. Our Mishnah is talking about holding on to the karkashta, the corners, right? But when you're but in the case of the Gemara, there are 2 things happening at the same time, right? You're holding on to a part of the object, and then as far as the rest of the object is concerned, it's like holding on to the karkashta, right? So one guy's holding on to 35%, one guy's holding on to 15%, and then there's a 50% that each one is holding on to the karkashta, which you're going to split. Is the splitting, is the parts that you receive, the 35 and the 25, or the 15 and the 25, is the principle the same principle, or are these 2 different principles? Meaning, when you split the rest, is that like saying that each one is holding on to half, literally, achiyot magas? But, since they're both holding on to the edge of the rest, it's as if each one's holding 50% of it. So the rule in all cases is achiyot magas. Just that if 2 people are holding on to the karkashta, then the equivalent of achiyot magas is 50-50. Or are these 2 different things? When you're really physically holding on to part of the object, then it's yours, because that's real tfisa. That's like motzi mechaver levaraya. That's command de pasuk dami, like they say about the Kinyan Sudar. But as far as the other 50% is concerned, that's not in the same level. So that's why the Shavua question is so important, right? The Rambam says that really you shouldn't have to take a Shavua on the 35% and the 15%. Why? Because that's like motzi mechaver levaraya. It's like your whole command of pasuk dami. It's like there are 2 objects or 3 objects. There's the 35% object that only one guy is holding. There's a 15% object which only the other guy is holding. And then there's the 50% remaining that they're both holding together. Says the Rambam, the real shvua is on the 50%. It's like 3 different objects. But it's not like 4 different objects, meaning the 35, the 15%, and then 2 25s. Everybody with me? I hope.
Yes.
But Tosas are saying, no, not true. The shvua goes on everything. Now, does that necessarily mean that what they might be saying is, listen, the proportions are a little different if you're holding on physically to a certain part. But when you're holding on to karkashta, that's just another way that's the equivalent of holding on to 50%, of Yodo Magas. So now look at the Rashbam. Look back, and we're going to end in one more minute. Look at the Rashbam and Bavasra. on page 1 of our Mar Makomos. And now we'll be in a position, just like I said before, Tosas and Bab Metzia uses an expression, Anan Sadi to come on to Tafis Dilehu. If you didn't know the Gemara on Gimel Amid Aleph, and more important, if you didn't know Gimel Amid Aleph and Dalet Amid Aleph, you couldn't fully appreciate why quoting that line is so significant, right? But what it shows is that Tosas really thinks that each person holding on his half on the karkashta is like a real tfisa. Okay? Now, look what the Rashbam did in Bava Basra. This is on page 1. Rashbam Asaf Bava Basra Lamadal base. Divra Maskal Hai Omar. What does he say? Hai Omar Didihu. Veloze Mukzakim. In the boat case, back in the boat case. It says neither one is holding on. Midila Rami Alami Masis and Shnai Moksam Batalis. So otherwise they would have had to, ask the question, how is this different than the first mission in Bab Metzia? Shnai Moksam Batalis. But then look at how he continues. Shazen notal ad yodam ad mokom sheyodam agas, v'zen notal ad mokom sheyodam agas. V'lomin and called the alam gavar. In the case of Shnai Moksam Batalis, each one takes the amount that he's holding. You don't say Kol Dalam Gavar. Whoa. That's what the Mishnah's not talking about Yodam Agas in Bab Metzia. The Gemara says on Zayin Amid Aleph, it's talking about Tfisa B'Karkashta. The Gemara contrasts Yodam Agas and Shnai Moksam Batalis on Zayin Amid Aleph. That the Rashbam is distinguishing, like Tosos, between Kol Dalam Gavar case and the Shnai Moksim case in terms of Ochsin, that's fine. But the continuation where he makes it seem as if the first mission of Bab Metzia is talking about Ad Sheyodam Agas, that's explicitly against the Gemara and Zayin Amid Aleph and Bab Metzia. What's he talking about? The answer is what he's talking about is simple. He knows that. It's just like what Tosas did, but in a different kind. What he's saying is, my read of Zayin Amid Aleph and the difference between Ad Sheyodam Agas and Shnai Moksam Batalis B'Karkashta is that the difference is a technical point only. It's not as if there are two different principles on Zayin Amid Aleph like the Rambam said, right? According to the Rambam, anything you have in your hand physically, that's one kind of chalukah. And anything you're holding on to together or at the edges, but you're not actually holding on to the substance, that's a different kind of chalukah. And therefore, one gets a shvua, the other doesn't get a shvua. The Rambam would never, ever have said that the Shnai Moksam Batalis case is a case that is equivalent to Ad Sheyodam Agas. But if you think that what the Gemara means on Zayin Amid Aleph is just in the numbers, namely that whatever you're not holding on to physically, it's as if you're equally holding on to physically, then substituting the words Ad Sheyodam Agas to explain the Mishnah, it's just in the Mishnah, the Yodam Agas legally is each one's holding on to 50%. But that's a real, but remember what the Gemara says about that. Kiman, dummy, it's as if it's
not that each one's holding on to 50%, but each one has they each have the 98% open, so they divide it so it comes to 50 each. In other words, it's almost a flip of that.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is the Rashba. Tosas quoted the Gemara in Gimel Amid Aleph and ignored Dalet Amid Aleph's Pircha because they wanted to make a point. And that is that even though we may not agree with the usage of the Gemara in Gimel Amid Aleph, this strong formulation that when you hold on to something, we really believe that the part you're holding on to or that you're going to, get because of your holding on is yours, bevadai, like Tosa said, that's Tosa's view. Because the tfisa and the chaluka isn't just to negate kol da'alam gavar, it's also to explain yachloku b'toras vadai. And that's the Rashbam's view as well, by quoting, again, there should be like a parentheses, in the printed Tosas, or the Rashbam, that says, Ayin Bamatzia Zayin Amud Aleph. The Rashash in Bava Basra does do that. He says Ayin Bamatzia Zayin Amud Aleph. Sometimes when people, overstate or seemingly overstate, they're taking a position. So that's what the Bali Tosa are doing. What I'm going to try to show next time is that the Riva, the second day of Tosas and Bava Basra, disagrees completely. And they think you can have Chalukah even without Ochsin completely. And I'm going to try to show you that Tosas Ridu thinks you need Ochsin, but Ochsin is a Safek. It's not Vadai Kol Echad. Because if two people are holding on together, that's different than each person holding on, separately to one person holding an object, another person holding another object. As long as they're still the same object and they're struggling over the same object, it's not so clear that you should say what the Rajbam and Tosas, and we'll see the writer of the Rajba say. So we'll continue with this and try to show the other side,
applying
Rambam next week.
proportion? What about applying to the same proportion throughout?
I'm sorry, I
In other
didn't,
words,
Rabbi, before
15
Dr. Weg. Rabbi, you were saying that we'll continue next week? Before
Yeah,
Dr.
yeah.
Weg?
But let me
Okay,
ask you.
thank you so much.
Okay, great. Let me answer the question.
So
It's a good
why not
question.
apply 35% and 15 that they're holding?
Right.
So it should be 70 and 30.
Yeah, logically, what you're saying is plausible. It's interesting that the Gemara doesn't say that. So the way it shows that they're not looking at it, that the in between is like influenced by the proportion that you have. They're seeing it as you're equal on the in between, and you have your physical tfisa. For the Rambam, it's better. For the Rambam was saying that there are two different things happening here. One is a chalukah based on Yodom Agas, and the other is a sha'ar. It makes the most sense. If the idea was that these things are merging, then you could have said what your idea, which is, the Yodom Agas dictates the proportion for the totality. And then you would say, break the whole thing down to, as you say, 70, 70-30. Yeah. But we don't say that. But is it a logical suggestion? For sure. And it's important to point out that we don't say it because it would have made sense. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting, I hope. And we'll continue in Yirtzeh Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a great week, everybody.